Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Responsible Statecraft has a piece entitled Western Paternalism in Africa Reaches Its Limits. Decades of failed policy, including U.S. and French counterterrorism programs, have some African leaders looking for alternatives. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, viral footage of recent pro-coup soldiers waving Russian flags in the face of cheering crowds provoked real concern, with major publications warning about a growing quote-unquote Russian influence in West and Central Africa. This followed recent statements from Secretary of State Blinken on, quote, countering Russian influence, end quote, on the continent and the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act, which has already passed the House. Dr. Horne, it would be laughable if it weren't so serious. This seems to me as though Blinken and Biden and the rest are reading their own press clippings about American exceptionalism and manifest destiny and all this other foolishness, because all African leaders know is American intervention, colonialism, oppression, and for other countries such as China and Russia to step in and working to provide assistance to them with a lot less ties and conditions and other things. What else are these leaders supposed to do?
That's a fair point. Not only reading their own press clippings, but other metaphors come to mind: eating their own dog food, drinking their own Kool-Aid. That is to say,
getting high off their own supply.
Oh, I forgot that one thing. I think that part of the problem is let's be charitable, the short historical memory amongst the leaders of the North Atlantic countries. Apparently, they do not recall the African slave trade, despite the fact that there are about 44 or 45 million people in the United States today who connect to that inglorious, lamentable period. Perhaps they forgot the fact that up until Nelson Mandela was elected in 1994, the U.S. administrations were thick as thieves with their counterparts in apartheid Pretoria. Perhaps they've forgotten the history of particular countries. For example, let's talk about French colonialism for a moment. Perhaps Paris has forgotten what Madagascar has not forgotten. That is to say, in 1947, there were tens of thousands of people in that nation off the southeast coast of Africa who were mowed down by French colonial vampires. And so this is what you see today, and the article in which you read, from which you've read, is the inevitable outgrowth, the inevitable outcome of these centuries and decades of exploitation and gross depredations visited upon Africa. And I think that what's increasing the hysteria in the North Atlantic camp is that this moving away of African nations from the North Atlantic camp is taking place at the same time when the North Atlantic countries are very alarmed about their own precipitous decline. I'm speaking of the deindustrialization of Western Europe, which is driven by this Ukraine escapade, which has led to an increase in energy prices and which has led many factories in the manufacturing giant that has been Germany, looking for warmer, figuratively, climes, including in the United States, but also in Asia. And then there's the rise of China, which we should all be paying attention to, because there has been a lot of loose talk lately about war with China. And what's so alarming about this loose talk is that I detect anti-Beijing sentiment in virtually every sector of the U.S. body politic. Not only does it unite Democrats and Republicans, but I detected in intellectual circles, I detected in left circles, I detected in Black American circles. So given this hysteria, it's not surprising that these North Atlantic countries are concerned that the continent, which allowed the North Atlantic countries to soar to number one in the world, speaking of Africa, that with Africa moving away and with China rising, it's unsurprising that they now begin to feel that mortality awaits.
Dr. Horne, a couple of I'm going to just read the headlines from 4 different articles. I'm just going to read the headlines. Demonstrators in Burkina Faso protest France and ECOWAS while waving Russian flags. Perspective, why are Haitian protesters waving Russian flags? Another one, why Nigerian protesters want French army out and wave Russian flags? Last one, why are protesters in Ethiopia and Mali waving Russian flags? All different outlets, and I see the same story over and over. And I'm thinking that in a way, I think these people maybe look at this and they see this colonial bully that nobody would ever fight back or push back. I think they see Russia almost like kind of a hero fighting back that bully, and some kind of hope that maybe this bully will be tamed so they can have an opportunity at some kind of independence or solidarity. Independence or sovereignty. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think what unites those headlines is the point that you can look high and low on the African continent, but it would be difficult, if not impossible, to find a former Russian colony. With regard to this hemisphere, with regard to the Americas, ditto. Of course, you can point to Alaska, but Russia moved out of Alaska in 1867. But I think that once again, those headlines are reflective of a much wider and deeper phenomenon. That is to say that instinctively, African countries are looking for a counterweight to the hegemony and domination of the North Atlantic countries. And they know that historically it was Moscow that supported anti-apartheid fighters in South Africa and anti-colonial fighters in Angola and Mozambique and amongst other countries. And even before 1917, even before the advent of the Soviet Union, as I've mentioned on this program more than once, and it's worthy of reflection and repetition, that in the 1890s, it was Russia that armed Abyssinia, Ethiopia, to the teeth, which allowed it to resist an Italian invasion. Now, there was a confluence of interests between certain African countries and Russia. That is to say, both had a mutual foe in Western Europe, and so it was mutually beneficial for them to come together. And what we need to reflect on today is if that is still the case, and if that is still the case, it helps to shed light on those very striking headlines you just recited.
I want to switch gears, and we'll go back to this piece regarding Chad. But I want to be sure I get your take on House progressives' retract letter to Biden calling for talks with Russia. Progressive Democrats in the House have retracted their letter after facing backlash, suggesting the idea of pursuing diplomacy to end the war in Ukraine. The Congressional Progressive Caucus hereby withdraws its recent letter to the White House regarding Ukraine, according to Pramila Jayapal. The letter was drafted several months ago, but unfortunately was released by staff without vetting. As chair of the caucus, I accept responsibility for this. Well, the letter was dated the 24th of October, and today is the 26th of October. The letter was signed by all names listed. And I wanted to get your take on this because I know this is the Progressive Caucus, not the Congressional Black Caucus, but I think the criticism of that organization would be the same. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly I think we should all pile on the Progressive Caucus for this weak-knee display of, on the one hand, trying to be hawkish, on the other hand, trying to be dovish, trying to run with the hounds and run with the hares and hunt with the hounds. But I think we also need to have a deeper dive. As I've suggested, part of the problem with the Democratic Party coalition is that the labor movement has yet to shake off Cold War nostrums, and so it tends to be a pro-war during the best of times. The Black community has yet to recover from the compromise of the 1950s, which allowed anti-Jim Crow concessions in return for throwing overboard people like Paul Robeson, who had a critique, an anti-imperialist critique of U.S. foreign policy. As noted, you have in the intellectual sector of the United States, you have a pro-war intellectual sector of the left intellectuals. And they may even be more dominant than the anti-war intellectuals on the left. And then if you look at capital, for example, finance capital, which has been a major bulwark of support for the Democratic Party, I'm thinking of the types like George Soros, for example, the Hungarian-American multi-billionaire. Now, given the fact that as a result of these so-called sanctions against Russia, the United States has basically seized about $300 billion in Russian assets. And Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, has been talking lately that these assets are not subject to freeze, they're about to be seized. And then there's this sort of loose talk about how it's going to be applied to Ukrainian reconstruction, allegedly, purportedly. But the finance capital mavens on Wall Street are licking their lips and salivating at the prospect of getting hold of that $300 billion. And so these are the ultimate puppet masters. These are the ones who call the tune, and then the politicians do the dance. And so I'm not asking for sympathy towards the Congressional Progressive Caucus. They deserve none. But certainly we need an explanation, because absent an explanation, we won't find a way to dig ourselves out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves.
You know, Dr. Horne, one of the things, and, I had to immediately pull out when the Progressive Caucus came out and they gave their reasoning, they said, oh, it was released accidentally by staff or something. It was actually written back in June. So I said, let me take out my investigator magnifying glass and look at and compare their statement. In their statement, they said Russia annexed some extra lands from Ukraine. But if it was written in June, Russia hadn't annexed those yet. So their excuse that it was written in June doesn't align with the facts in the letter, which makes a claim about something that didn't happen in September. I mean, that's not important. I don't know, but your thoughts?
Well, once again, I think we should use this as a lesson, as I'm sure Dr. Leon would agree, a lesson in political science 101. Which is basically that these politicians, bless their hearts, are basically front men and front women. That they're basically the carnival barker helping to attract the marks into the tent so the marks can be fleeced. And so the men with pot bellies and handlebar mustaches can walk away with all the loot. And so this is the ultimate lesson of this fiasco, this debacle with Congressional Black Caucus, Freudian slip there, Congressional Progressive Caucus, although we should mention in all fairness that the Black Caucus is a significant component of the Progressive Caucus. And I don't think that we'll be able to escape these kinds of catastrophes unless and until we understand more deeply how they occur and then begin to try to do something about it.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.